Alright. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. So we begin by praising Allah, the one who has revealed to us the best way of life, the way to live, and not only He's revealed to us how to live, but He's revealed it in a medium and in a way that's actually very digestible and very adaptable for all of the different circumstances which we'll face throughout life. And we send peace and blessings upon the last and final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This class is Islamic Law 3. And Islamic Law 3, I think it's called the Principles of Islamic Interpretation, something like that, Principles of Interpreting the Quran and Sunnah. So this is the title of the class. Now what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be building on Islamic law. And as I mentioned before, you do not have to have taken the previous class by necessity, but it's a recommended prerequisite. So what that means is anything that we've covered in Islamic Law 1 or Islamic Law 2, I'm not going to go into it in detail again, because it's already been taught in those classes. So if you have any particular question regarding that, or if you'd like more details on something along, something about that, please ask outside of class, because we've already technically covered that inside of class. Because those students who've taken it, we don't want to hold them back, and we don't want them to be missing a lot of things. So Islamic Law 3 is going to be covering this subject which is known as Usul al-Fiqh. And we're going to talk about what that is. But the law itself we've covered many times. We've talked about how this law and this way of life is a code of conduct. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah the greatest, has taught us a code of conduct which is actually suitable and relevant for all times. And what we're going to be studying in this subject, in this class, is exactly how the Quran and how the Sunnah, or the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, are supposed to be understood correctly. So in the previous class we were talking about the law itself. Now we're going to be talking about the foundations or the sources of the law, which are mainly the Quran and the word of Allah and the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. How to understand them correctly so that you actually are at the right understanding of the law. The reason why this is so important is because anyone can claim, they can make a claim that they're following the Quran and they're following the Sunnah. And I think almost every Muslim would claim that they're following the Quran and Sunnah. Every Muslim, whenever they try and quote, or they try and argue, or they try and speak to somebody else, they're trying to justify their opinions, their views, whatever it may be, that they're grounded within the Quran and the Sunnah. So anyone can claim that they're following the Quran and Sunnah, especially when they have all the texts available. So nowadays, if you look at, we have, how many of you have a Quran app on your phone? Right? Vast majority of you, right? So you say, well, I have the entire Quran available. So this other person who, doesn't even have the copy, I technically have more in my possession that I can readily access than the other person does. Same thing with hadith, right? We have databases of hadith, or databases of what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, either in our libraries, in our bookshelf, either through translation, or because we know Arabic, so then we claim that, well, since I know Arabic and I have the books, and you don't know Arabic, then I know more than you and I know better than you. Or you have a database which you can search. So there's many people who have all of these texts available to them due to two main revolutions. One is the printing press revolution. Everyone's got books in their house, which was not the case in the past. And the second revolution is digital revolution. Everyone's got these books digitized and freely available, or available for purchase. Yet, these people who possess the text still fail to understand exactly what is intended in them. And this is what this class is supposed to solve. So I'm going to give you one example. I'll give you an example of one of my friends who studied with me in France. We were actually roommates. And he went through the 2-year Arabic program. He was an Arab himself, but his Arabic wasn't that good. So he went through the 2-year Arabic program, and when he got to the 3rd year in our Islamic Studies program, somebody introduced him to a program called Al-Maktaba Al-Shamila. Anyone heard of this program, Al-Maktaba Shamila? A few people, maybe one person has. Al-Maktaba Shamila is, at that time, it was a 2 gigabyte software program, which is freely available, which contains, it contains the Quran, obviously, it's a typed out text. It contains every single collection of hadith with the vowels. It contains every major book of fiqh, every major book on history, every basically Islamic book that you would generally refer to. It contains every single one of them. And including that, it contains all of the books that study the narrators of the hadith and everything, in digital form, in searchable form. So the moment he got that, he said, you know what? He quit school. He literally quit the school 2 months into the program, because he said, what do I need? What do I need all of this other, studies for? I got everything on one CD, on one DVD. And I can search everything myself, and every time he'd go in the class, he would argue with one of the sheikhs, and he says, look, I got all the hadith. I can search for the hadith myself. You don't know. So this is a problem. And the problem was long story, but the problem was that this class was taught in the following year. So he never even got access to it. So he never made it to this class, unfortunately. We saw him 2 years later, where he came back, and he was at the same level of knowledge, or perhaps at the same level of ignorance, if you want to say, that he was before when he left the school, unfortunately. And that's because having the tools with you to understand and having the actual content are 2 different things. And our teacher, when he was advising him not to leave the school, he gave a very good example. He said there are 2 people who can go hunting. Going hunting for, birds or whatever it is. So 2 people go hunting. One of them has a 6-shooter with 6 bullets. And one of them has an Uzi, machine gun, right? Miniature machine gun. Full clip of 100 shots, automatic rapid fire. And he says, do you think that both of them are going to hit the equal amount of animals if they don't have the same level of skill? He says, no. The guy with the Uzi, he can have 100 bullets, but he's not going to hit anything if he doesn't know how to aim and if he doesn't know how to hunt. And the guy with 6, he's going to hit the mark with his 6 because he knows how to hunt. And he said hadith and Quran and the amount of verses that you have memorized and the amount of text that you have, it's the same thing. If you don't know how to use them, if you don't know how to understand them, you're not going to hit your mark and you're going to misunderstand them. So that's exactly what we're talking about today. So it's become a very common practice for many Muslims to say, we will directly go to the Quran and we will directly go to the Sunnah. It's very common. You've heard this before? We've heard it before, right? Now the thing is, when they say they're going to go directly, usually what ends up happening, or what that statement means, is that they're going to go directly without any scholarly explanations or anyone else's explanation, but we're just going to go to the text, and we don't want to hear the commentary or read the commentary about what anyone else is saying regarding this thing. Right? Now, the reason why this has become very popular and very common to go back directly is because they feel that Islam has been distorted by a group of scholars or by a group of people or by a group, whoever it is, and therefore the only way to restore Islam to its pristine form is to go back to the original and find out what it really said. Now, is this a legitimate concern? Definitely. It's definitely a legitimate concern. But is this a legitimate approach, and is this the solution to the problem that the people are facing? The answer is no. So the problem itself is a real problem, but the solution is mistaken. And the reason why it's mistaken is there's one fundamental flaw in the understanding of those people. And the flaw is that they believe that all the texts, every single word, every single verse, every single statement of the Quran and the Sunnah can be understood by just any person. Because if they're saying that I should go directly to the text, they're also saying that you should go directly to the text, and he should go directly to the text, and she should go directly back to the text. Which means that you don't need to have any level of expertise or background knowledge or whatever. This is kind of implied in the statement. You don't need to have these tools or these things in order to go directly and understand the text. It's for everybody. It can be understood. Now the problem with this is this doesn't apply to the Quran, it doesn't apply to the Sunnah, and it doesn't apply to anything else. And one of the simplest examples would be, even if you take a novel like Harry Potter, it's a children's book, right? How many of you read Harry Potter? Right. I'm not going to ask you to make tawbah for that, but Russ, you've heard of it, alhamdulillah. So, children's novel, Harry Potter. Right? Now, are there going to be some adults who are reading that and they don't understand some parts of it? Obviously. There's definitely going to be some parts, at least in some parts of the story or whatever it is, where someone doesn't understand what's going on. Maybe if they read it 2-3 times, they're not going to understand exactly what's going on. Right? Not every single person is going to understand 100% of it. And that's given. Almost everyone understands that. So why is it that they think that the Quran and the Sunnah are supposed to be somehow an exception to the rule? Yet, the claim would be, the Quran and Sunnah is meant for everyone. Well, Harry Potter is also meant for everyone technically. But you do have to have some understanding of English language, some understanding of, fantasy and fiction and, writing style and all of that. You have to have some background understanding in order to understand it correctly, otherwise you can make a mistake. So the same thing, we should be very careful to not apply this across the board too strictly and think that, we have to take this approach. So there's this, another reason why people take this direct approach is there's this fear. It's in the back of everyone's mind. There's this fear that Islam is going to be controlled by an oppressive, tyrannical, unjust clergy who's going to be restricting, or who's going to be interpreting all the text, just like the Catholic Church or like some other rabbinical authority, and other people don't have access to it, and only this elite group is going to have access. So there's that fear. Of course, Islam doesn't have that concept of clergy or whatever it is, but there's that fear, right? So there are many well-meaning Muslims who took this extreme reaction and said, we need to just get rid of all this commentary. And I'll tell you, I used to be among this group. So I'm telling you, I understand them very well. Sometimes it gets to the point where even when you're reading the translation of the Quran and you see something in brackets, even if it's one word, right, one like it or one pronoun or something like that, you say, well, I don't even want to read what's in the brackets. I only want to read the word of Allah. Right? I don't want to read what some translator or threw in there or something like that. And I'm not the only one. I've seen many people in the same boat, having the same mentality because of the background. I don't trust the other people, so I'm going to check it for myself. So the well-meaning, they have a good intention perhaps, but the approach is incorrect. So this is what we're going to be focusing on. So this is actually a naive view. The reason why the view is naive when you understand it is because human language, the way that human language is expressed, is vague. That's just the way that we speak. It's always some ambiguity in the way that we speak. And Allah and His Messenger chose to use the vehicle of human language to communicate. Right? Because otherwise we can't understand anything. Right? That's what the Quran is in our language, so that we can understand it, human beings' language. So let's take a simple example. One statement, any random statement that a person makes, you can have a ton of questions that you start asking. So let's take one very simple statement. Okay? Statement is, somebody says that you should never cross the road without looking both ways. Anyone heard a statement like this before? Heard it, right? Seems like a wise statement. It's a pretty wise statement. Most of us probably told our kids that. Don't ever cross the street without looking both ways. You even remind adults, make sure to look both ways before you cross the street. Now let's take a look at what are some of the ambiguities in that sentence that you can ask legitimate questions to in order to get clarification. So the first question would be, in order to understand what did the speaker really mean, right? So the first question would be, who is this speaker? And why is he saying something like this? Is he concerned about you? Is he a parent? Is he this? Is he that? You need to know the background of the person and what context the person is saying in order to get a better understanding of what they really meant. Right? So that's number one. Question number two is the word never. Should the word never be taken literally? Never cross the street without looking both ways. Right? So should you take the word never literally, or should you not take it literally, meaning never means never, never? So let's take an example. Right? Are there any circumstances where you can cross the street without looking both ways? Of course there would be, right? What if there's no cars? Right? What if there's no cars on the road at all? Can you cross? Yeah. Then the question arises, what if there's only pedestrians? Do you still have to look both ways? Because was the speaker trying to warn you only about vehicles? Or he was trying to warn you about pedestrians as well, because they could be dangerous pedestrians maybe? Or was he trying to warn you about bicycles as well? So do you have to be concerned if there's a roadblock on one side and a roadblock on another side and there's no cars allowed in, but there's bicycles allowed in? Did they intend that you watch out for the bicycles and the pedestrians or not? This is a legitimate question to figure out what was the intent of the person when they actually made this statement. Then there's another thing. What if there's a sign that tells you it's safe to walk? So when you're crossing the street at a signal light and then the walk sign comes on, how many people check both ways still? Some do, right? Some don't, right? Some don't, well they will not check. And they say, hey, the sign, the sign's generally 99.999% right. Right? You're going to assume that red lights are on the other side. Other people are not going to come. And even if they did, you're going to get hit anyways because you'll be in the middle of the street. So it doesn't matter if you see them coming. So was the speaker trying to alert you to the danger when there's no signal? Or is the speaker trying to tell you, don't trust the signals? You still need to look both ways. What's the real intent? It could be this or it could be that. So one statement, we're zooming in and we start going and asking all these questions. These are all legitimate questions. To do what? To find out the intention of the speaker when they made that statement. What if you're in a hovercraft or you're in a helicopter and you're hovering above the street, 5 feet above the street, or let's say 10 feet above the street? Do you still have to look both ways? Because the cars are not going to hit you. You could just cross through. What did the speaker really mean? So you can see that there's just this line of questioning, can keep going. And you say, you know what, the word both. You use the word both, right? So do you have to look both ways if it's a one-way street? Then you don't, right? So was the speaker trying to tell you both means both? So, or can both be not restricted to both? It could also be restricted to one under certain circumstances. Or could it be more than two? What if you're diagonally crossing an intersection? Anyone ever seen a signal like that? I have. I've crossed, right? How many ways you gotta look? You gotta look all the ways, if unless you trust the signal, right? So it's more than two. So here's the thing. In human language, the person just said never, and then they said look both ways. And the never didn't mean never, and the both didn't mean both. It could have meant one, it could have meant three, it could have meant four. And you say, whoa, language is really ambiguous. Do you think that this doesn't apply to the Quran? Do you think that this doesn't apply to the Sunnah or the statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him? It applies just as much as it does to their statements as the statement we just analyzed. This is not computer science language. In computer language, I just happen to be, computer scientist, when you program, you want to go and account for every single possible variable. And if you speak in computer language, you're going to be a social outcast and you're never going to get married, and no one's going to ever want to talk to you. I guarantee you. If you're trying to be a purely logical person all the time and account for every possibility, you'll never be able to function in life. So that's why it's very important for us to understand that human language, because the Quran and Sunnah came in human language, all these ambiguities naturally they're going to be questioned. So the same lines of questioning apply to all the sources that we have in Islam, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose this message to communicate it. So this class is going to be an introductory class to the subject. The goal is to simply open up your mind. These are the number of goals. Goal number one, I'm not following the PowerPoint here. Let's see, where are we? Yes. Blessing. Yeah. So goal number one is to to open up your mind to understand what questions are supposed to be asked whenever you encounter a verse in the Quran or a statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him. What questions are you supposed to ask, and which questions are legitimate questions? It's number one. Goal number two is how have these questions been answered by the experts, meaning by scholars who are in this field, their specialty in this field, and how have they tried to maintain a level of consistency. Because if you say that the word never in this sentence does not mean never, and then there's another sentence which says, never associate any partners with Allah. You say, well, you know what? I don't trust the word never anymore. You've broke my iman in the word never. So I don't believe in the word never anymore. So therefore, if never doesn't mean never here, doesn't mean really, then even this, it could mean never. Maybe, you know what, there could be very circumstances where we could. And the answer obviously is no, you can't. Never means never here. So how do you know it doesn't mean never here, but it means never here? You have to have some explanation which is consistent across the board. This is exactly what we're going to be covering. The third goal is for people to understand and realize the complexity that's involved in understanding the text of Islam, in the Quran and Sunnah, the level of complexity that's really involved, so that people will humble themselves. They will humble themselves and they will not jump to rash conclusions about what this text really means. Because you will always find this scenario, many people have found this scenario, is that somebody comes in front of someone who's very knowledgeable, right? And they start arguing with them, and they say, you know, but there's this hadith where the Prophet, peace upon him, he said this. He says, that's not what the hadith means. No, the hadith is clear, and the hadith is authentic, and then the person cannot sit there and explain the entire science of, you know, we're going to be covering in like a minute or two. So no, I want you to explain it right now. Cannot be done. So the thing is, the people, when they humble themselves a little bit, they will realize that a lot of the things that they thought they understood, or they thought they knew, or they thought they were 100% certain about, they will be a little bit more cautious. Okay? So you have to realize that this class, what it's going to do for you, this is the way it's going to go, so that you don't start panicking. Okay? The way it's going to go is the example Imam Ghazali gave. Imam Ghazali gave an example. He said, once you realize that some of the things that you thought were solid, and then you realize that they weren't solid, and we're not talking about, you know, your underlying faith or something, these are small principles. You thought that they were solid, but they were not, you found out you're really wrong. He said, you cannot just try and piece it together. So he said, it's like a glass. And once that, because if you're on a shaky foundation, meaning you're not really an expert in this field anyways, you've never really studied this, and now all of a sudden you learn all this, and you realize, you know what, this glass is broken. The glass will break. And he says, you can't just go and piece the glass back together. He says, the only way that you can remake this glass is to do what? Melt it and reshape it back from scratch. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So in the beginning, your mind will open up a lot. And maybe your head will be spinning after a few classes, and you're going to be thinking, I can't believe, you know, I never even thought of it this way, or I never looked at a text this way, I never imagined this, you know. And I remember when I studied the subject, I used to be walking down the hill, and my mind was thinking about this. I said, I can't believe we learned that point today. I'm in the shower, and I'm just thinking about this thing. I'm going here, I just couldn't get out of my mind. So you may experience that, but at the same time, once it opens up, the goal is not to get you into a relativist thinking that any interpretation is okay. You can make 100 interpretations. You can make 1,000 interpretations. The goal is then to mold you back into, okay, and these are the interpretations that are acceptable. Okay, so just keep that in mind and don't let that, throw you off. The fourth thing is that you will realize that there's not one single literal reading of the text that, gives you the actual import or the underlying meaning of what the Prophet or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was trying to say. Shakespeare made an interesting point, and he said, even the devil can cite scripture for his own purpose. So anyone read Shakespeare? Yeah? So who knows where this is from, this novel? You didn't come across Merchant of Venice, right? Merchant of Venice. No Shakespeare fans here? Okay, that's fine. I wasn't either. Actually, I got this from a book on the Quran, so I didn't read Shakespeare. So that's fine. And it's hope that you're going to start understanding why scholars differ, and it's hope that you're going to start to appreciate the levels of complexity involved, and you might appreciate different scholarly opinions rather than think that they're just a burden on the community. Because when you look at it from an individual, man, I hate hearing an answer from one shaykh, and then the other shaykh goes, 6 months later, I follow what he said, and then he gives me a different opinion. I really hate that. It's so annoying. And once you understand why, it's not going to be as annoying. You're going to say, wow, that's interesting. I never looked at it from that angle. I'm still going to follow one of them, but I never thought about it from the other angle. That's interesting how he derived the other one. So that's supposed to get you there. The literature on the subject, on this subject, particularly in the English language, is extremely, extremely rare. There's almost, I only know of like three or four books now on the subject. And like literally, that's it. It's very, very tough to find anything on the subject. So that's why the recommended text was selected, not because it's an ideal text, but because there's just nothing else decent that's available. And usually these texts are very academic, because the reason why these texts were written or they were translated is because people who are studying Islam or Islamic law in a university, they just translated it for them. They never decided to put this in front of the common people, and it could have been done. So that's what, just keep that in mind. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a better understanding of Islam by studying this subject and taking this class, inshallah ta'ala. So now the introduction. That was just the introduction to the class. So let's begin. So as we know, alhamdulillah, Islam is a complete way of life. And we've talked about that several times, that complete way of life means that Allah teaches us every single thing that we should be doing in our life. They're practical instructions, practical guidance that we have, and that covers our individual existence, and it covers our social existence as well. Now all of these things, they don't come from our own reasoning. Right? So we have to keep all of this in mind, that whenever we study Islamic law, we have to remind ourselves that this law is a blessing from Allah. It's a blessing from Allah that we have these rules and these regulations, because the law itself is guidance. And it's guidance coming from our Creator, who knows us better than ourselves. So He knows exactly what we should be doing, how we should be functioning, the same way that any engineer or of a device or something like that knows all the features and the hidden features and everything. Right? Anyone know, anyone have Android 4.4 by chance on their cell phone? Okay, I guess you got Android 4.4. Okay, were you able to pull up the little Kit Kat screen with the candy? It's a little hidden feature in there. Were you ever able to pull it up? Probably not, right? So, unless somebody really hinted you at that, or someone just has hours and hours to play around and push every single button on every part of the screen, they're not likely to come across this little thing. They're called Easter eggs that they implant in there. And usually one of the engineers or software designers kind of leaks it to people. And they say, you know what? My advice is go to the settings page, and there's a setting there. Just keep on clicking on one of these settings and something interesting is going to happen. So you go to your Android phone and you keep on clicking on one of the settings, and all of a sudden, boom, this thing's going to pop up with some funny little candy moving around and stuff like that. It's a little game, right? But you wouldn't know that if the designer had not told you. The same thing with our laws. The same thing with our rules. So it's a blessing from Allah that we have, rather than playing around trying to figure out what to do in life. Alhamdulillah. But the problem is, even though it's a blessing to have all of this from Allah, if we cannot understand these instructions from Allah properly, then you know what's going to happen to this great guidance that we've been given? It can become a burden. It can actually mislead a person away from what's good for them. And that's why we find whenever people talk about law or religious laws being a burden, and so, it's just keeping society back, or it's doing this, it's doing that, that's usually, if not almost always, a misunderstanding or a misapplication of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was really teaching. So if we misunderstand the law, or we misapply the law, this can become a huge burden, and it's going to become a major problem. So we need to keep that in mind. And remember that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said that whenever Allah intends to benefit somebody, He gives him a deep understanding of the religion. So whenever Allah wants to do good to someone, He gives him a deep understanding of the religion. But what does this deep understanding consist of? What is the deep understanding? Right? What does it mean? It means there could be two possibilities, right? So for some people, this hadith or the deep understanding is something elusive, something spiritual, right? Allah just kind of gifts it to some people and they just kind of understand. And you can't figure it out. Now there's an aspect of that, but the other aspect is something that's very concrete. It's something that you can actually learn. It's something that you can talk about. It's something that you can discuss. So there's two main aspects that are needed to understand Islamic law properly. And that is number one, proper knowledge of the principles of understanding of how to do things. And number two is sincerity. And sincerity is something that you can never measure. It's not something that you can know. Because someone can have the knowledge, but they cannot be sincere, and then they can play around with certain laws, or they can make some modifications here and there. You have to have both. Now sincerity can be studied, but it can't be measured. The knowledge can be studied, and the knowledge can usually be measured as well. Okay, so this is something that we need to realize from the beginning. So what is the proper knowledge? Right? What does it mean to have knowledge of Islamic law or these principles so that we all want to understand Islam correctly? So what knowledge do you actually have to have as a prerequisite to understand Islam and Islamic law in particular correctly rather than making a mistake? A good analogy is the analogy of doors and keys. So think of it this way. So you have every door, or most doors, they have a key, right? So what you want to do is you need that key in order to open the door. Now the keys are the principles and the methods that you're going to be using to understand the texts, right? And you have to get through the door in order to understand it correctly. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything. So when you are like a scholar, for example, who's a specialist, they are the ones who have the tools to make the keys. And why do they have it? Is it because Allah just gave it to them? Is it because they were born into a family? No. What makes a scholar in terms of the original? It's somebody who studied the doors and they've studied the keys. And this is their profession, this is what they do, this is their field. So once you get into it at that level, you begin to get an understanding. Imagine an amateur locksmith who doesn't know what he's doing. And he says, I can do the same thing. Wow, look, I've seen that. You know what? You put something in the door and you just turn it and all of a sudden the door opens. This guy will come and think you could just put anything in there. Any piece of metal you put in the door, it's not going to open. Or if your key fits, you say, oh, the key fits. That means the door is going to open. Doesn't mean the door is going to open. So you actually have to know and have an understanding of these keys and how they're actually going to unlock what Islam is actually trying to say, what Allah was trying to say, what the Prophet, peace be upon him, was trying to say, what we call Quran and Sunnah. So anyone who thoroughly studies these texts in detail, right? There's a number of things. You need to thoroughly study all of these texts in detail, number one. Number two, you need to be conversant with the philosophy of language, which I just gave you an example of, right? How language can be ambiguous, you need to understand the philosophy of language. Number three, you need to be aware of the history and the context in which this statement was actually made, right? And you need to know all these other things, which we're going to talk about. The whole class is about this. So these are the blueprints for the keys, and these are what we call the principles to understand Islamic law. And that's where the word usul al-fiqh comes from. So the word al-fiqh we talked about in the previous class, it means Islamic law. We're roughly translating it as Islamic law. And usul means the principles. So these are the principles which will unlock or give you an understanding of what Islamic law is, where it comes from, how to formulate it, how it comes about. Okay? So these are needed to figure out what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger really intended. Now when it comes to categories of what is law, if you think about it, every single human action, everything you do can be classified in Islamic law. It's either being something that's mandatory, you have to do it, right? Like praying 5 times a day. As something that's recommended, you should do it, right? Like giving charity, extra charity. Something that is permissible, right? You can do it or you cannot do it, right? If you want to stand, if I want to stand and teach this class, or if I want to sit and teach this class, both of them are allowed, they're pretty much permissible. Something that's disliked, right? It's better that you don't do it. and something that's prohibited. You're not allowed to do it. Every single action can be classified. The majority of your actions throughout your life are going to be in which category? In the permissible, right? Neither recommended nor disliked. Neither prohibited nor obligated. But at the same time, there's still a ruling. And the ruling is that you're allowed to do this. Right? So that every single action can be classified in Islamic law under one of these categories. Right? So, with varying degrees of emphasis, right? So this means that every single thing that we do, we can actually be doing it with the approval of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something amazing. So, but there's one issue. It would be impossible and impractical to detail each and every single one of these things. It's allowed for you to stand, and it's allowed for you to sit, and it's allowed for you to do this, and it's disliked for you to do this, disliked for you to do this, disliked for you to do this. It's recommended for you to imagine what the Quran would be. Right? It would be this giant rule book or something like that, or the Prophet would just be going on and on and on like a law book. It would be very impractical, very boring, very problematic. So instead, you find that the vast majority of what the Quran and the Sunnah is saying actually consists of general principles which you can use to build law. Okay? Now be careful when I say build law. When I say build law or make law, it doesn't mean that we're making the law ourselves, but it means that we're taking the principles that Allah and His Messenger gave us in order to define what the law is supposed to be. That's what we say when formulating law, or when deciding, what a ruling is going to be, right? So, a good example to think of is raw material in manufacturing, right? So you have a heap of plastic, metal, silicon, some other parts, right? If you have just giant blob of all this stuff sitting here, do you have a cell phone? You don't. Even though you have all the parts for the cell phone, you don't. Until an engineer comes, gets all these parts proportionately designed and molded in exactly the right shape, right place, right everything, then you have a phone. It's structured and it functions and it works. The Quran and the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith, they're exactly like this raw material. You could have all of them sitting there in a book, but that doesn't mean that you actually have law in the book. Until you're able to take it and do something with it, understand it, process it, and once it's processed, then you got the law. And that's why you have books of law, and you have books of Quran and hadith. The reason for the difference in the two is one of them is processed with an emphasis just on law, reworded, nicely presented, organized, structured, put in this subject. That's the reason why there's a difference between law and between these sources. Okay, so keep that in mind. So the final say on this is a summary of what we're saying basically. Islamic law tells you what to do. You need to pray 5 times a day. You need to fast in Ramadan. You need to do this. You need to do that. You don't need to do this. And the principles of Islamic law, or usul al-fiqh, tells you how you know. How do you know that that's true? Where did it come from? Prove to me from the Quran, prove to me from hadith that what you just said is true. That this is what really Allah wants from me. You have to prove it. That's what usul al-fiqh basically does. That's what this subject is going to do. So, there are several verses in the Quran, as we mentioned already, and teachings in the Prophet ﷺ that can easily be misunderstood by someone who doesn't understand the principles. Let's take some examples, some very concrete examples. So here's a verse in the Quran. It says, O Prophet, fight the unbelievers, fight the kuffar and the hypocrites, and be stern against them. Right? Be stern against them. Now, this first example, it can imply a number of things. First of all, let's look at the word unbelievers, kuffar. Is this a word that is a general word, right? What does unbelievers mean? Is it referring to a group of people, or is it saying unbelievers as a blanket statement? It's a term. It's a loose term, right? What we call a loose term. Now the question is does this term have a general meaning or a general import, or does it have a specific import? If it had a general import, what would the implication be? The implication would be that the Prophet was ordered to fight every single unbeliever in his life for the fact that they're unbelievers. That's what it would imply, right? Because that's what the word, if the word was general, that's what it would imply. But in reality, Muslim scholars said, no, this word or this term here is linguistically general, but its meaning or its import is specific to a group of people and does not have a general meaning. Right? So that's very important to understand. Otherwise, you'll have somebody misunderstanding that. And you find every Islamophobe, on the planet is, somehow memorized this verse, even when Muslims haven't memorized it, and they start going and they start talking about, look, because they didn't understand that there's a principle that not every general, what they call linguistically general term, has an import of a general term. Right? And this is something that it can be proven very easily. It can be proven in human language, and it can be proven in the Arabic language, and it can be proven through the Quran itself. So we'll talk more about that. But then you have other issues. So other issues would be that somebody sees this, and you can imagine this happening if it hasn't already happened, right? If you've never encountered it. You can imagine somebody sees this. Imagine you're in an argument with some really hardcore, right-wing, conservative, evangelical Christian who's trying to, convince you to, join their faith and leave your faith and how bad Islam is and everything. And all of a sudden they quote this verse and you're like, oh no, how do I explain this? It means everybody. Islam can't say this. So all of a sudden you go and you figure out a way out, and you look into a dictionary and you find out, oh, the word kuffar was translated wrong by Yusuf Ali and Pickthall and every single translator ever in the English language who ever translated the Quran, all 100 of them or whatever, they all translated it wrong. So the real meaning of kuffar is farmers, right? It's farmers, right? Because there's actual proof from the Quran. One, in Arabic, the word kuffar also means farmers. You can check any dictionary. And there's another verse in the Quran. Actually, chapter 57, verse 20, the same word kuffar is used for farmers. So this was talking about fighting the farmer. There were probably some bad farmers or something like that. So we're not talking about fighting the unbelievers. Well, someone can go and take this and change the entire thing around, again, because they don't know which term means what in what context. Right? So there's a problem. So they don't understand. If you don't understand certain linguistic principles, you're going to fall into this trap. And this is what many people do to justify usury, interest. They do to justify that women's dress code is not as the general Muslims believe the dress code to be, and so many other issues, right? Because they go and say, well, we can replace this word, and look, there's a linguistic meaning. If you go to any language, or especially the Arabic language, or a very rich language, you go and you say, okay, this term, I don't think it means what these people are telling me it means. I'm going directly to the source, and I'm going through my Mawrid or Hansware dictionary or Lisan al-Arab, whatever it is. And you go and you say, oh wow, look at this word. This word, according to dictionary, has 6 meanings. Which meaning should I pick? Well, let me figure out what I think this word should be. And then you go and you figure out, this is a very incorrect way of trying to understand Revelation, but this will happen if you don't understand certain principles. But someone can go and be very tempted, very sincere person. I'm trying to defend Islam. I'm trying to protect this Islamophobe from making fun of our religion. And you're going to blame me that I put farmers in here? Because you had a good intention, but you didn't know what you're doing. So you have to be very cautious and careful about something like this. So Muslim scholars have been unanimous that farmers, kuffar, is implied in chapter 57. But in chapter 9, verse 73, kuffar means unbelievers. It does not mean farmers in any way, shape, or form. And there's a reason for that, which we're not going to explain right now. The same phenomenon applies to sunnah. And many of you probably, you've never seen anyone really misled by this example, right? Outside of, the second part of the example. But I guarantee you the second example I'm about to bring to you, you probably have encountered, some of you at least, have encountered someone or yourself who has been misled by this example. Now take a look at this one. Even the sunnah, or the prophetic statements, can be misunderstood. There is a hadith, statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he said, when any one of you enters a mosque, when you enter a masjid, let him not sit down until he has prayed 2 units of prayer. So anytime, this statement is saying, anytime you enter the mosque, You should not sit down until you've prayed 2 minutes of prayer. Now, linguistically, right? Linguistically, on the surface, it seems that number one, anyone who sits down before doing this is actually sinful because they disobeyed the Messenger of Allah. Disobeyed what the Messenger of Allah said. And you could go and quote verses of the Quran that says, whoever disobeys Allah and disobeys His Messenger has done such and such. And the people who disobey the Messenger of Allah, and whenever you're in doubt, you should go back to the Messenger of Allah. So many statements you can quote and quote and quote. And all of a sudden you just say, wow, man, this person is really sinful. Now the problem here is that when you don't understand, or when someone doesn't understand, that a linguistic prohibition does not always amount to a categorical prohibition across the board, then they're going to think that this is the case. And they're going to try to see there's going to be a problem. Now here's the thing. Muslim scholars, there's almost a virtual 99.9% consensus among scholars, Muslim scholars, that this hadith is not prohibiting people from sitting down before they pray. This is only a recommendation. It is not a prohibition. 99.9% of scholars. And I mentioned the one example who's maybe an exception or maybe not an exception. It's doubtful whether they're an exception or not in the footnotes. Now the thing is, there could be two reactions. Okay, and you'll find two reactions in the Muslim community. One reaction is, see, I told you we shouldn't trust these scholars. Probably they didn't know this hadith. They probably never came across it. There's sometimes people just have in their mind, they probably never heard it. And you find people making judgments all the time. Somebody walks in the masjid, and all of a sudden sits down. You're looking at them, guy doesn't know the hadith, man. If he knew the hadith, he wouldn't be doing that, right? All of a sudden, then you see, Shaykh Muhammad Faqih walks in the masjid, and he sits down. He said, Astaghfirullah, man, I thought this Shaykh studied like 10 years, man. I can't believe this. And now all of a sudden, without confronting him, without checking, without knowing anything, I don't go to that Shaykh anymore. I found a new group, down that area. That Shaykh teaches the hadith. All he does is he just quotes hadith day and night. That's all he does. He doesn't give khatiras and random thoughts like, this other Shaykh is doing. This guy is 100% Quran and Sunnah. All he does is quote Quran, all he does is quote hadith. That's where the real knowledge is at. And I don't want to go to this guy anymore because obviously he doesn't even know this hadith. But you know what? The Shaykh has studied this hadith. The Shaykh knows not only the hadith, he knows the import, and he knows when to practice it, and when he wants to do a recommended act, he'll do a recommended act. And whereas maybe such and such brother or Shaykh or whoever it may be, they're sitting there, you think that they're teaching you something else, but in reality, they're just simply taking the surface text of what you almost could have just read yourself in a book, and you think now, you know what? This is where it's at. These other people, all misguided. And it's happened. It's happened to me personally. And has anyone ever gone through something similar like this? Am I the only one? A lot of people, quite a few people. Right? So the thing is, this subject is there to broaden our understanding so that we don't fall into something like that. And this could be even more dangerous, like I mentioned. Even more dangerous than just judging one person, oh, you're sinful because you didn't pray. Now you say, you know what, okay, I accept the principle. I studied usul al-fiqh. I took the class. I accept this principle, and now I understand that just because there's a prohibition doesn't mean it's a 100% prohibition across the board. It could just be disliked, right? And you say, well, I'm going to apply this across the board. So when the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he said, do not associate any partner with Allah, look, linguistically it's the same thing. That's just a recommendation. Right? I can go and visit this guy's grave, and even if you say that it's a little bit like shirk, it's a recommendation, do not steal. It's recommended, Try not to steal, unless you need it or something like that, Do not commit fornication. These are all statements of the Prophet. So, well, only if necessary or something like that. So you say something, if you can't, so now there's a level of consistency. You say, well, I want to be consistent. If I apply it here, I got to apply it here. But there's a lot more depth involved, right? Someone else can come along, and I'm stretching a little because this is a really important introduction. Someone else comes along and says, you know what? I saw that the scholars, 99% of the scholars said that this is not a prohibition. I got it. I figured out why it is. I have to have a good opinion about scholars. So I trust them. I know what they're saying. So you know what the explanation is? I'm sure I figured it out. See the word when he said, when any of you, he was just talking to his companions. So it applied to them, but it doesn't apply to us anymore, right? So I solved the problem. That's probably where they came up with it. So you can come up with all sorts of explanations. Not all of them are correct. Right? And you begin to understand what's correct, what's not correct, and all of that. Right? Let's see. So this is actually not a modern phenomenon, by the way. This is not something that it just came about in our age. Verses of the Quran, Hadith, they've been misquoted since the beginning of time. And I'll give you one example. From actually one of the companions. Okay, even the companions are the greatest of people. But even they make mistakes sometimes. This one in particular, I'll give you an example. So during the reign of Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, okay, he was the Khalifa. And one of the companions, Qudama ibn Mal'un, he was actually one of the very early Muslims, pretty early Muslims, had fought in the Battle of Uhud and all of that. He was caught in a state of intoxication. He was drunk. And people caught him. So they went to Umar, who's the Khalifa, and he started, questioning him and everything, and he started to justify himself, right, by using a verse from the Quran. And the verse that he mentioned was, he says, there's a verse in, where is it, Surah Al-Baqarah? No, Ma'idah. No, it's not Ma'idah. It's Ma'idah. So in the 5th chapter, he says, there is not upon those who believe and do righteousness any blame concerning what they've eaten, if they fear Allah and they believe and they perform righteous deeds. So he's understanding this verse of the Quran literally. Okay, this is chapter 5, verse 93. He's taking it literally and saying, there's no blame on people. There's not going to be any blame on you for what you've eaten. As long as you fear Allah and you're a true believer and you do good deeds and everything, which the guy did. He was a true believer. And the Prophet vouched for him that he's a true believer. So this guy is saying, so you can't punish me. You can't put the lashes on me and with the punishment and everything, because look, the verse exonerates me from guilt. So the other knowledgeable Muslims in the community, they explain, like Ibn Abbas and other scholars, they came and they said, no, you missed the context of the verse. This verse was talking about Muslims who didn't know about the prohibition of certain foods. And now that the prohibition came, they'd already eaten those foods, or they were used to drink before or something. And now they're so concerned, I did this in the past, and I just found out now that it was wrong. And they were so concerned, so Allah reveals this concerning them, saying that you don't need to worry. As long as you're a true believer, as long as you did this, whatever you have eaten in the past, meaning before this was revealed, not what you just ate while knowing that you were eating it. So he gave the context of the verse, and obviously enacted, the punishment on him and everything. So the thing is, people have misquoted the Quran before. Sometimes good people can misquote the Quran, sometimes bad people will misquote the Quran. It's very important to be cautious regarding this matter, okay, regarding this issue. Should we take a break? Or should we finish the introduction? Let's finish the introduction. All right. So revelation and rationality. So when it comes to the difference between revelation and how we use our mind, now we see that we need to use our mind a little bit, right? We need to be a little bit smart, to be a little bit intelligent when you're looking at this text. Divine revelation is naturally superior to human rationality, right? Because the source, Allah is the source of revelation, our mind is the source of rationality. And our minds are limited, and Allah is the creator and He is the all-wise. So obviously, revelation will always be superior to rationality, right? But at the same time, you have to realize that you have to have a proper understanding, or proper reason, or proper way of thinking in order to correctly understand the revelation. So just the revelation itself is not sufficient. There's a level of intellect that needs to be applied to the revelation in order to understand it correctly. So this is one of the major differences between Islamic law and what we call secular law, or man-made laws. Islamic law is built on revelation. Secular law or man-made law is built purely upon rationality. Let's do a quick comparison of the two of them now. So, if you have Islamic law based on revelation, right? One of the benefits that's there is that it's stable and it's more continuous throughout time than any type of secular law. Because the latter one, secular law, is based upon human rationality, and reason fluctuates with time, with the place, as well as with your mood. You don't always think straight, right? So if there's a community that's reacting to some incident that just took place, their laws that they're going to be passing or that they're going to be thinking of is going to sometimes be an extreme reaction to something that happened. And this is what you find in many laws. So for example, there are sometimes positive reactions and there are sometimes negative reactions. Take the example of freedom in American society. This emphasis on freedom, 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 right? You go to the UK, which is, very similar to America in very many aspects, and they don't have this concept of freedom, freedom. You don't hear, freedom this, freedom that, we're free to do this. So what's the difference there? Difference is historical context. I see America was trying to liberate themselves from European which is British colonization. There's this concept of freedom that was pushed as a reaction to something. This idea of freedom from the church, from the Catholic Church, Protestant, right, protesting against the church. There's this idea of we need freedom from this, tyrannical authority. So there's these so many reactions that we find, and then sometimes that just becomes part of the law, part of the psyche in people's minds, and they didn't really think it through. And this is something very dangerous. That's just a small example. But if you look at sexual relations today, if you look at how we deal with homosexuality or the idea of transgender or the idea of these things, in terms of how socially acceptable they are and how we react to something like this, it's something that you can't imagine. The entire community had a completely different view 30 years ago. And all of a sudden, within a decade or 2 decades, the view completely changed across the board. You find that people who you never thought would ever reverse their stance all of a sudden completely change. The point is, not to delve on that, but human reason is infallible in the sense it's very changeable, it's very malleable. It goes this way and that way depending on your mood, depending on other influences. So Islamic law has more stability in it, and there's a benefit to that stability. But at the same time, it has, the underlying principles are static, but it has the ability to adapt and be flexible to different times. And that's what many people don't realize. It does have the ability to be flexible and to adapt, to change circumstances, right? So, take an example, in terms of trade, right? Trade used to take place during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, during the time of the early Muslims, in little marketplaces and all of that. So if rules were made specifically for marketplace transactions, and now we have Amazon.com and eBay and we buy stuff online, if those rules were so strict and set in stone that they could not be ported and modified over to online transactions, you'd have this level of rigidity that you wouldn't even be able to adapt to the modern circumstances in which we live. But Islamic law has that vehicle built in, and we're going to be studying that in a lot of detail when we go through this subject. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why the Quran actually said to the believers, don't ask too many questions. Don't keep asking the Prophet so many questions, because if he gives you the answer in a specific way, that'll be binding on you. And if it's binding in your different circumstance, you can't apply that. So the point of this verse is not, sometimes as some people think, that don't ask too many questions, because if you know, then you have to do it. So ignorance is bliss, we don't know, great, this is a bit easier. That's not the import of the verse. The import of the verse is don't ask so many specific questions when you have general principles that you can base this ruling on. And that's exactly what this science is going to be doing, usul al-fiqh. So you take these general principles, and these general principles can answer several questions. One principle can address so many different issues that you face in the community, so it prevents the law from becoming a burden and like this rigidity and not being able to apply across the board. Lastly, before we break, if you look at secular law, Even secular law, man-made law, is built on principles. And these principles also require interpretation. So if you look at a simple example, the US Constitution, right? It has the Bill of Rights, it has other amendments and all of that. You have to have a judge in America to interpret the Constitution and then apply it. And then you have the ultimate authority, the Supreme Court, which is going to decide finally, this is the right interpretation of what this Constitution is trying to say. So there is still an understanding, an ambiguity in language, an interpretation, understanding that's needed even when it comes to man-made laws. So if someone were to say that, well, this oracle, why didn't Allah, clarify or something like that? Even people who clarify, there's still a level of ambiguity that requires you to think through that way. And when it comes to different schools of thought, I'm saying this because this is a common problem in the community. You say, why there's so many schools of thought, and why do we have to have school? Why do scholars differ? I don't like the fact that they can't just unite upon one answer or something like that. Even when it comes to the Constitution, there are different schools of thought. Right? There's the one school that's known as, take things literally. See the Constitution more literally. It's known as what? Anyone know? Strict constructionism. Right? Strict constructionists. Other previous President Bush and stuff like that, he actually enjoyed that kind of mentality. He was actually praising one of his cabinet members or one of the judges for doing that. Anyways, so there's different, even when it comes to man-made law, human law, there are different schools or different ways of approaching and trying to understand what the text is. Right? So there's loose understanding, strict understanding, literal understanding. And we're talking about man-made law, and we're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about a very small, tiny little document, actually. There's not really many principles here. Such a small document, right, that was supposed to be a bunch of laws there. Despite all the complexity of interpreting and all of that, how many times has the US Constitution been amended? Anybody know? 27 times. Absolutely. Did you read the text? Okay, you got it from the text. Huh? All right, 27 times. Even though it's so limited, has very little, stuff in it actually. So divine revelation at its core has more stability than secular law actually has, and that's really a blessing from Allah. It's something that we need to keep in mind. Okay, so let's take a break for 10 minutes. We resume at 9:02. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa ba'd. So continuing, where are we? The history of this subject, or the history of this science. So this is actually considered to be a science or a subject in and of itself. So the history, let's take a look at its formation. I don't like to study things as a formal science or subject. I'd rather like to see how they came about in the first place. So starting from the beginning, these interpretations and these principles, where did all this start from? So if you look at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, what happened when he was alive, whenever there was an issue or there was ambiguity in the Quran that needed to be explained, there's nothing I can do about that. Whenever he needed something explained, what he would do is he would be the one who's explaining the Quran. And obviously, because he's the messenger of Allah, he's going to be guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make sure that he's interpreting things correctly. When he gives one of his own teachings, what we call the sunnah or his statements, the hadith, if there was a clarification that was needed, the companions used to ask a question that says, "O Messenger of Allah, what does that mean? Or how can you say something like this, right?" Like for example, there's a hadith where he said, help your brother whether your brother is the oppressed or the oppressor. And then somebody says, "Whoa, how can we help him if he's the oppressor?" So they're asked for a clarification. So instead of a scholar having to come later or somebody coming later, he clarified his own statement on the spot right there, because that statement needed some clarification for some people. Right? So, rather than leaving us in the dark, he clarified it himself. Now, in case he made a mistake, what if you say, well, what if the Prophet was clarifying something in the Quran and he made a mistake? Well, if he made a mistake regarding something, he was corrected by Allah. And this is actually in the Quran, in quite a few places. Examples are, you can go back and check them, chapter 66 verse 1, chapter 80 verse 1, and other places. So there are corrections taking place. If there was something that he did wrong or whatever it may be, Allah would not allow that to remain. And we'll cover that more in a different class. When the companions didn't have access to the Prophet, peace be upon him, then what happened, even when he was alive, right? Because he didn't have text messaging service, right? Where people are texting him all day, like they do to our local scholars here, which we don't really mind actually, but as long as they're relevant questions and not gym-related inquiries, fortunately. But so when the companions didn't have access to him, if they're traveling or if they're taking care of their sheep on the hill or something like that, and they need to know something right now, and they can't access him, they can't walk all the way there, so what did they do? They actually tried to figure out what does Allah want from them, or what was the Prophet trying to say, or what has he taught us that we can figure out kind of what would Allah want us to do. It's a very simple question. What would Allah want me to do? And what category would it fall into? Is it recommended? Is it prohibited? Is it required? Is it just I could choose? It's okay, permissible for me to do? So they tried to figure it out. And then when they went back to the Prophet, they explained and they checked with him. Was our understanding correct? This is what happened. This is what we did. Do we do a good job? Are you going to be happy with us? Or did we mess up? Or are we going to start crying? Do we have to ask Allah for forgiveness for our stupidity? I mean, what do we need to do? So this is what they did. So there's many occasions where this happened. Several occasions we've already covered in a lot of detail. So I'm going to summarize for you from the Islamic Law 1, and we covered it even in Islamic Law 2. So on one occasion, Ammar ibn Yasir, what did he do? He was on a journey, and he needed to take a bath. So he needed to make a ghusl, required mandatory bath before he can pray. But he couldn't find any water. And he knew that when you need to make wudu, you don't find any water, you can just rub your dirt on your hands and on your face. So what did he, tayammum, dry ablution. So what did he do? He's made an analogy. What we're going to study called qiyas. He made an analogy and said, look, if it's your hands and your face that you're doing, if you need a bath, you're supposed to wash your whole body. So he jumped on the floor, on the sand, and he started rolling around. And he said, in his own words, he said, I started rolling around like an animal. So he starts going around. Can you imagine this guy's flapping around in the sand, putting some sand in his shirt here, and getting some under there, all over the place. And then he got up and he prayed. Yeah. So then he went back to the Prophet, and he said, Prophet, this is what I did. Did I do good? He said, Ammar, you didn't need to do that. Right? You just need to do it the hands and the face and you're good to go. You don't need to do any extra. For the ghusl you do dry ablution, tayammum is the same way as you do for wudu. So he tried to figure it out, but he was wrong. But in the end of the day, what's the worst thing that happened? He just got a little dirty. Well, that's it. It's okay. He got access to water again, cleaned himself off. No harm, no major harm, and probably he's going to be rewarded for his intention because he tried to do a tough one, right? He tried to do something harder. So inshallah he's going to be rewarded for his intention. But then there's another example where there was a group of people where they gave a judgment to one of their friends and says that, you have a wound on your head, you need to wash that wound. And he put the water over his wound and he fell down and died. So they went back to the Prophet and they told him what happened. And he really got upset at them. And he really yelled at them. He said, how could you do? You killed this guy because of your ridiculous, your foolishness didn't you think? Why would you do something like that if you guys don't know? Don't do these experiments or something like that. Don't give verdicts without thinking. So he got really upset with another group of people. There was a third group of people. Third example is a group of people, one of them prayed in one time, another group prayed in a different time. And then they went to him and they asked him, well, which one of us was correct? And he said, you're both correct. So in that case, both of them were correct. He said, both of you are okay because of, their understanding was good, their intentions were good. So that actually opens up a door for pluralism in the community. Pluralism means that you have these different acceptable opinions which are okay. Even though the Prophet may have only meant and intended one thing, because two people understood it differently and both of them, they were not so far off, or they achieved the aim anyways, right? Then it was okay, and the Prophet approved of that. I think I mentioned another example. I guess not. Okay, so these incidents that we have here, they prepared the companions for the future. When the Prophet would not be there anymore and they could not double check with them, it got them in the framework of thinking. You know what? Sometimes your thinking is right. Sometimes your thinking is wrong, but not a big deal. Sometimes your thinking is wrong, and it's a huge deal, and you guys should not be the ones thinking. You should go and consult somebody else who's a better thinker than you. Right? So it kind of sets some examples. So after the Prophet, peace be upon him, passed away, now the Muslims, they couldn't go back to him anymore. And they had to deal with new issues which never arose before. Different trading practices, different type of food they're going to be encountering, different people they're encountering, different lands that they're exploring and everything. And also questions which they never explicitly asked him exactly the detail of this question, so they didn't have the answer. They had the general principle, which they would have to interpret. So now things have changed. So what happened during this time was the more knowledgeable and the more intelligent, and I'm putting both in here. So the knowledgeable and the intelligent companions, they kind of became like the authorities where the other companions would go to. The ones who were a little bit more clever, they were smart, they were hardworking, they were studying, they were really good memories and everything like that. Some people are a little bit sharper than others sometimes, but it's not sufficient to simply be sharp. You need to also study, you need to be dedicated, you need to obviously be sincere and all of that. So they became like the scholars of the community. Like Ibn Abbas and Ibn Mas'ud and Abdullah ibn Umar and all of that. So they used to go and consult them. So there were scholars among the companions as well. They didn't all have just the same level because they were not all specialists in terms of all dedicated to just studies. And the level of their intelligence differed. So what happened at this time was there were private issues that people had. Do I pray this way or do I pray that way? If I'm fasting and I sneeze this way or something happens, what should I do? These are private issues that affect you as an individual. So when there was a private issue, what used to happen is they used to go and consult these authorities. And sometimes one authority will say, well, my verdict on this is this. And another authority will say, no, my verdict is something different. Right? And whichever group, if you go and you consult that one and you follow that person, you're okay. And if you went, sometimes they would go and say, no, I'm going to follow this other person on a different verdict, on private issues. On public issues, there's a difference. The difference is, on a public issue means something that's going to affect the entire community. Right? So are we going to allow this type of economic transaction in our community or not? This is something that has to be enforced by the state. Which means you cannot have two opinions being implemented. You're either going to do it this way or you're going to do it this way. You cannot have two things at the same time. So the opinions may have existed, but they adopted one opinion for the public. And this is something where many people don't realize. One of the reasons why we as Muslim minorities in the West face all of these, there's so many different opinions. Why can't we just unite on one opinion? It's not about just uniting on one opinion. It's because there's no enforcing body among Muslims that says, we're going with this opinion and this is what we're going to do. There's nothing like that. But when you walk into the masjid, for example, if the masjid administration says, hey, we're enforcing this type of dress code in our prayer area of our masjid, that's the opinion. There's no difference of opinion. Well, the other scholar has a difference of opinion. It doesn't matter. That's good. But what's going to be implemented is one opinion, because you can't implement two opinions at the same time in one place. So if we had a governing body, that would obviously bring more unity to things. So there's a difference in public issues and private issues, and this is the way it was during the time of the companions living after the Prophet, peace be upon him, because they couldn't go back to the Prophet. So this is what happened at that time. Now, when these scholars among the companions, when they were deciding on issues, they had certain principles in their minds. Right? They were just randomly coming up with answers. Right? They have principles in their minds that they're coming out and giving these rulings. Is this wording general, or is it specific, or is it this, or is it that? They have it in their minds, but it's not documented. It's not explicitly documented in some organized fashion in terms of a book. Right? And this is actually akin to the development of any science. Every single science passes through the same phases. You have to understand that. So if you look at any other type of science, it eventually gets written down. Right? It didn't exist before. So eventually these principles and everything, they got written down. Books were compiled, like a generation later. And they started coming out with, this became what do you call it? This became a science in the true sense of the word, right? Documented, organized, books and everything. Likely, one of the reasons why this was codified and turned into a science completely is because they wanted to prevent people from making mistakes. And a great analogy is grammar. If you think about grammar, grammar is the best analogy. If you look at language, right? What comes first? It's not the chicken or the egg argument. In terms of language, what comes first? Language or grammar? They don't come together. In the history of human beings, what actually comes first? Not only from an Islamic perspective. The language. Right? Any society, the language comes first, and what is grammar? All grammar is analysis of language that's in use to put certain rules to tell you if you're messing up or not. That's it, right? That's what grammar is. So actually language precedes grammar, and it's not being written down. But if you're studying language, one of the first things you learn is grammar, right? So if somebody comes along and says, hey, you're grammatically incorrect, right, what you're saying. That can work for now, but if you go back and you look at, let's say, ancient Arab, old Arabs, and you say, look, I studied Arabic grammar, right? This is grammatically incorrect. You don't have any right to say that because grammar didn't exist at that time. The language he's speaking was way before grammar was even codified. You take English grammar now and you go to Shakespeare and you say, man, this guy doesn't know English. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. You can't apply that, right? It's the same thing. So this came and was codified for a reason. Why do people study grammar in the first place? So you don't keep making mistakes in language. Same reason why this science became codified and popular, so you don't make mistakes in interpretation, because so many people were making mistakes, so we need to codify, document these principles, hash them out, make sure they're very clear, so that people don't make mistakes in understanding and interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. So eventually what happened was, anyone who wanted to speak about Islamic law wouldn't be taken seriously unless they knew the science. Same like grammar, right? If someone wants to speak about language, talk about the intricacies of language or something, if you don't know the grammar of the language nowadays, you say, no. A lot of people, I encounter this, it's a little problematic. A lot of Arabs I see, when I tell them, you know what, you're making a little mistake here and there. No, I'm Arab. Right? You know what? You're not ancient Arab, right? So if you were ancient Arab, that would apply. The fact that you're Arab now doesn't mean that you're, not going to be making what's called lahan or making mistakes in the language, because the grammar has been codified now. This is the way you're supposed to be utilizing the language. Right? So this argument doesn't apply, right? So the thing is, some people will say, well, there's a hadith, or there's a this, or there's a that. It became common. Anyone who wants to talk about Islamic law, if they are not familiar with the science, they really don't know what they're talking about, right? So this is why this subject is, and there's a good reason for it. So this is not, see, a lot of people when they hear something like that, I know it can be very, sometimes sound demeaning to someone who doesn't understand the context. So if somebody goes and says, but if there's a hadith, you don't know what you're talking about, Go study 5 years in a seminary, right? And then you'll understand. And what does that person think? Man, these clergy, they think they're some elitist sitting in an ivory tower, and I can't understand. I'm a smart person, man. I graduated from, I graduated medical school or law school. You can't explain it to me. Now, in reality, that person's statement is correct. Maybe not the wisest, nicest statement given the background of the person. But in reality, that's literally true statement, right? You're not going to understand this if I sit there and explain it to you in 2 minutes. So if during a Q&A session I said 60 seconds per question, you ask me a question, you say, no, but there's a hadith about that. I said, look, that's not what the hadith means and I cannot explain it to you. No, I want proof. You will not understand the proof of what you're asking for in 60 seconds or in 5 minutes that I can explain it to you. So this is what happened with this science, same thing. So today, is it important? It's important, in my opinion, for the average educated Muslim to at least be familiar with this science so that they can do a number of things. Two things. Number one, so that you can avoid mistakes in interpreting texts that you come across yourself. And number two, so that you can avoid being misled by quack scholars, right? By quack scholars, meaning people who pose as scholars, and there's a lot of them today, especially with YouTube around. There's a ton of people just, anyone who picks up a book and reads a few hadith and can nicely articulate some Arabic pronunciations with the huruf al-halaqi and all that. All of a sudden, mashallah, this person is going to be considered a scholar, or someone who can quote verses from memory, or quote hadith from memory, right, with the chain of narrators. All of a sudden that person is considered to be a scholar in the eyes of many people because they don't understand the complexity that's involved in understanding and interpreting. Anyone can memorize. A parrot can memorize hadith. You can train that. Parrot to do it doesn't mean that they have this deep knowledge. So these are the two main reasons of studying it. And also to realize that there's not only one correct opinion all the time, that you have to enforce it upon everyone else. So there's three reasons. Furthermore, maybe reason number 4, some laws may not apply in a certain context. And you need to understand that so that you don't apply it incorrectly. So these principles help with that. And lastly, there are several new issues that have arisen in our times, particularly related to financial contracts and in the medical field, which really require a good grounding of this science to craft the answers and understand the answers that are actually coming out there. Otherwise, again, you could be misled. So methodology of this book it's not been developed yet, so you can just skip all of that. There's a lot of technical terms in this science. It's a very highly technical field. So the way that I'm going to deal with technical terms in this class is that I'm going to give a loose translation of the Arabic terms rather than a literal translation of the terms, so that you can actually understand what the term is kind of meaning. And I'm going to give the Arabic terms in brackets in the book and kind of mention it from time to time, so that in case you wanted to continue studying the subject somewhere else, you don't have to go back and relearn all the terms. Because a lot of times people will just quote all these terms, like, oh, you don't know this term, you don't know this term, you don't know Am, you don't know Khas, how could you study the subject if you don't know the term? So the term is not the field, but it's important to know the term if you wanted to keep on studying, right? So hopefully I'll be able to compile a glossary, and then you can go and look at these terms, okay? Next, moving on, the sources and methods of Islamic law. We'll go on for about another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll break for questions and then announcement from our youth committee. So the sources and methods of Islamic law. Yeah, I'm way behind on this, right? Okay. So the first thing we cover are the sources and the methods. So whenever any question arises and you want an answer to it in the field of Islamic law, the first source you always go to is the Quran. Quran is the number one source, right? If the Quran is explicit and is clear about something, there's no need to check any other source. This is what the Quran says, and it's very clear. There's no need to go somewhere else and check. So for example, someone wants to find out what is the ruling on taking interest. Right? Is it forbidden, permissible, recommended, disliked, or permissible? Along those lines, right? Taking interest in financial transactions, all you gotta do, check the verses of the Quran, like for example, chapter 2, verse 279, it clarifies that interest is prohibited. So the ruling on interest, without defining in detail what interest is, the ruling on interest is that it's prohibited. You're not gonna find anything that says interest is recommended, or interest is obligatory, or interest is permissible, or someone, the ruling from the Quran is clear as daylight. It suffices, you don't need to go to any other source. Now, if someone has a more specific question, like for example, what is the real definition of interest? Does interest apply to commodities in addition to wealth? Because usually when we say interest, we're talking about like cash and wealth, right? So does it apply to commodities in addition to money? So you look in the Quran and you don't find anything that clearly tells you about that. So then you go to a second source. And the second source is you check the Sunnah. Check the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the teachings of the Sunnah clarify for you that even in commodities, there's a principle like if you trade dates, or salt, or barley, or wheat, or anything that's in disproportionate amounts, that's still considered riba or interest, and is prohibited in Islam. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, defined in more detail that it's not only for gold and silver and money and cash, it also applies to commodities as well, in case there was any ambiguity in that. So there's two sources we've covered, right? What if you don't find it in the Quran, and you don't find it in the Sunnah clearly? So you gotta go and check some other sources or some other methods. Where do you go? What is the source that you refer to? That's why we call it either method or source. Source meaning, where do you go? What should you do? So let's take an example. An example is, one of the most common methods that's used is analogy. Very, very common method known as qiyas, which we're going to cover in detail. So somebody says, okay, is it allowed for me to smoke weed, smoke marijuana, to get a nice recreational high, you know? I feel more spiritual as a person, and I really concentrate in my prayers, you know, whenever I'm high. So am I allowed to do this? Is it permissible, recommended, disliked, assuming that my prayer is even better? Could it be recommended? Could it be obligatory? Because Allah does want you to concentrate in your prayers, and I have a problem concentrating when I'm not high. So is this allowed or is not allowed? So what you do is you say, okay, go to the Quran. There's no verse about marijuana. Okay, there's a verse about eating plants, which I've seen it being argued that means that it's okay for you to smoke weed, but it's not. Then you go to Sunnah, and you say, there's nothing there either, obviously, because this was not a common drug at the time of revelation. So then you go and you say, let's apply analogy. So analogy is the next source that you move to. So you apply analogy and you say, look, if you look at intoxicants, which are prohibited in the Quran as well as in the Sunnah, the intoxicants get you in a state of intoxication, or get you into a state where you're not able to think straight. And marijuana, when you get high, it does the same thing to you. So because the two states are similar, and that even though the two substances are different, one of them is liquid, one of them is solid, right? The liquid or liquidity, or the fact that one is solid does not affect the ruling, and you learn how to figure out when it affects and when it doesn't affect. See, because the reason for the prohibition actually is similar, therefore by analogy, marijuana and other drugs should also be prohibited for recreational use without any doubt. So you apply analogy as a method or as a source to figure out when something is not there in the Quran or something is not there in the Sunnah. And there are many other sources or methods that you apply. So this is the first section we're going to be covering in this class about sources or methods of where do we go to. So let's start with number one. Number one is the Quran, as we've been saying. So let's take a look a little bit about the Quran, what we need to know about the Quran before we can start using it as a source. So the things that are directly relevant to our discussion is, first of all, the Quran is the direct word of Allah. That needs to be very clear. Quran is the direct word of Allah. It's a guide for us in our life. Every single verse is coming directly from Allah, meaning it's of divine origin. There is no doubt about any of these verses, and the fact that they have to be accepted by every Muslim and they need to be followed in their entirety. So there should be no doubt about that, no ambiguity in that at all. So that means that what? If somebody finds a problem in a verse of the Quran, it actually means that the problem is with the reader. It's not a problem with the verse. It's a problem with someone who's understanding it, right? Because there's this, obviously there's this new trend of just taking what you like. A lot of people enter into Islam with the mentality that, I think the Quran is a really good book and I can learn a lot of stuff from it. A few parts I don't agree with, but there's a lot, I really want to be a Muslim. That's not the way Islam works, right? Islam is, if it's a book from Allah, something you're accepting 100% as a whole, right? So if there's a problem, it's like someone who's sick. Somebody's sick, and you put some really nice sweet drink, tea with honey or whatever, it's going to taste bitter for them. So the problem is with the person, it's not with the actual drink or with the Quran. So from an epistemological perspective, now epistemology, you don't need to know this term, but what it means is what constitutes knowledge. Right? It's a philosophical term, it's a loaded term. What constitutes knowledge in terms of certainty and doubt, how much you believe in it, and what level your certainty is on all of that. When it comes to the Quran is certain with regards to its authenticity. It's 100% certain with regards to its authenticity. And this is known as qat'i al-thubut. So qat'i means something that is 100% certain. Right? It's clear as daylight, absolute. And thubut means something that is, fixed or stationary. It's referring to the authenticity or the transmission of the Quran. The fact that what we have today is the original Quran, 100%, no doubt about it, that is 100% certain. So this is known as every verse in the Quran, without a doubt, is certain with regards to its authenticity or its qat'i al-thubut. So there's no doubt about its preservation. But when it comes to the wording of the Quran, right, it's not every single verse or every part of a verse is qat'i, meaning 100% clear, without any doubt, without any ambiguity. But rather, it's known to be probable with regards to its meaning. And this is known as dhanni ad-dalala. Dhanni means probable. Some people have translated different ways, but dhanni basically in this context means something that you pretty much know what it's talking about, and you can figure out what it's saying, but there could be a different opinion, or it could be that you might make a mistake in understanding exactly the import of this. So the transmission is fine, 100%, that this is the word of Allah. What is the import from this word, this verse, or this statement? This is known as probable. Okay, dhanni ad-dalala. Dalala meaning what it's indicating, its indication. Okay, so it's probable with regards to its meaning, and it may be open to more than one interpretation. So if something is dhanni ad-dalala, meaning probable with regard to its interpretation, there might be more than one opinion on it. If something is qat'i ad-dalala, meaning that it's certain with regards to its what's the word I just used? With regards to its meaning, there's no doubt about it. There cannot be a second opinion. So for example, when we say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say He is Allah the One. So we say Allah is one, ahad. The word ahad, one, it means one. Right? When we said don't cross the street, you have to look both ways. It wasn't both. It could also be one. It could also be 0, it could also be 3, it could also be 4. When we say ahad, one literally means one, and it is certain with regards to its meaning. There cannot be a difference of opinion on this one. But when you take another verse, right? So let's take a verse which is not certain with regards to its meaning. Here's an example. Example is that one of the verses in the Quran states that when a person breaks their oath, which we studied in the previous class, right? When somebody breaks an oath, they have to compensate for breaking that oath. Does anyone remember what the compensation is? And for the sake of time, one of the compensations is to feed 10 needy people, 10 poor people. So that can be a compensation for breaking an oath, right? So you have to feed 10 poor people. Now the thing is, the number 10 is 100% certain with regards to what it's saying. So 10 people does not mean 9 people. 10 people does not mean 15 people. 10 people means 10 people. Somebody says, you know what? I think I'm just going to do 5. No. Okay, I think I have to do 15. So what part of 10 don't you understand? 10 in this context means 10. It doesn't mean 15, doesn't mean 20, doesn't mean any other number. Right? But The question is, no one can claim another number, but what constitutes a needy person? Right? What's the definition of someone who is in need? There's ambiguity there, right? Somebody who has $50 in the bank account, $5 in the bank account, someone who has zero, negative. What is the definition of what a needy person is? So the word needy in the verse is what's known as dhanni ad-dalala, or probable with regards to its meaning. You can figure out kind of where the meaning is. There may be one opinion, two opinions, maybe three opinions. All the opinions are very close to each other and they're within the circle of probability of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really intended. Okay? Now another question you can ask is, do the 10 needy people have to be different people, or can it be the same person you feed him 10 times? Imam Abu Hanifa, one of the scholars, one of the founders of one of the famous schools, the Hanafi school, he said, you can feed one person 10 times. And the other schools, they said, absolutely not. It is not allowed. 10 people means 10 individual separate people. Now, why are they differing? What's the underlying reason for it? There's a lot of reasons, but some of the reasons is we're trying to figure out what is the underlying wisdom of this verse. You broke an oath, you got to feed 10 poor people. Well, what's the reason? What's the real wisdom behind it? Is it because the penalty is primarily to help the poor? Is the reason, the focus is we have to help poor people? That's why. If the reason is to help the poor people, then is feeding one person 10 times okay? Yeah, if the reason is to help poor people, it's okay. Okay. What if the reason is to punish the rich person? Punish somebody who has money? Then the underlying principle still applies, right? What if it's to fight hunger on a massive scale? No, because you're not fighting hunger at the same level, because you're not feeding 10 different people. Right? So there's a little bit difference, right? So if that's the reason, what if the underlying principle was to redistribute wealth in society? Again, you'd want to have the 10 people, right? What if it's a combination of all of these things, right? So to figure out, that's why you have different understandings, different ways of looking at things. So even though you have sometimes ambiguities in verses of the Quran, the actual Quran consists of less than 10% of all, if you count all the verses, the quantity of verses and words and everything, less than 10% of the Quran actually has legal import or legal content, meaning it's about laws. Because the Quran doesn't only have laws, it has theology in the sense of teaching who Allah is, what to believe in, all of that. It has stories, it has admonition, it has so many other things. So it's not just the book of law. Less than 10% of it is actually about strict like laws. So, and out of that 10%, not every part of the verse is ambiguous, right? There's very few ambiguous parts. So if somebody says, oh no, Quran is ambiguous, just look at the ratio and then you kind of come back and you reshape that glass a little bit and you say, oh, okay, because you broke the glass for me, so now you're reshaping, you come back and say, oh, okay, that's not too bad, that makes sense. So the Quran is in the Arabic language, and it needs to be understood through the medium of the Arabic language in order to get a proper assessment of what exactly is being said. So that's all we're going to say about the Quran. Open it up for a few questions and then announcement at the end, inshallah. Questions? Yes. Yes.
So you said that in the Quran says 5 and turning 10.
Yes.
We don't need to count.
Yes.
But then, how do you know, like, when we had that deed for I'm doing something in one of our classes, didn't exactly mean 100, even though it's number here, maybe saying of the day that we might come here. So is that what we're studying, is how you have to figure out?
Yeah. So how does 10 mean 10? And then there's another hadith where I said 100 doesn't mean 100, right? In another class. How do we know that? We're going to study that. We're going to study that. Yes. Please, brother, keep it to questions. We can only take questions. We can't take comments. That's a CIS policy. So, inshallah. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
What's the meaning of converted law? Is it converted between or meant or?
I'm sorry, what's the word you use?
Converted in fiqh.
Oh, comparative fiqh. What is it?
What's the meaning of
Comparative law. Did I mention it in the book? Is it mentioned here? Did I mention it in the class? It's just outside question. So CIS policy, we only take questions which are, relevant to the class, directly relevant. You can ask me outside, otherwise. Any questions? Yes. Okay. Are we going to go into details in the 4 schools of thought? On some opinions we are, but we're not going to be studying them in like massive detail, not in this class. In the next Islamic law class, we're going to go into a lot more detail on contemporary issues only. Otherwise, there's encyclopedias written. Sheikh Wahb al-Zuhaili, he wrote a book called Al-Fiqh al-Islami wa Adillatuhu, all 4 schools of thought, and 15 volumes. So 8,000 pages, So we can't, even if we sat here and just the whole class, we just read it only, without commentary, we would never finish reading the book in the class. It's not possible. Yeah, your question? Yes. Okay, I see your second question. Can you clarify your first one? What do you mean punishable?
You mentioned that some opinions,
punishable in the sight of Allah?
for example, the governing body decides that this opinion is better, and it be punished better.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the question is, if there's a governing body who's taking one opinion and applying it in public, can it be punishable? Meaning, can they punish a person for not adhering to that opinion? Absolutely. Yes, they can. So the thing is, that's the whole point of a law being binding. So if somebody says, well, in my opinion, I don't think the one sip that I drank constitutes as, whatever, and they say, hey, you're going to be punished for that. You can get punished for that. I mean, so yes, it's definitely, it's binding. So the fact that it's binding, whatever it states is going to apply. No, it's not. Yeah.
How can we transfer competition based on
Right. Alright. So how do we come to a conclusion of what to follow and what to apply when we have 4 different schools of thought and different opinions? So that's exactly what we're going to learn in this class. We're going to learn how they come about, and 2, in the end, the actual decision of which opinion to follow. Usually, it's actually been explained. We have, everyone can just stay for a few minutes. We have Brother Raymond Elias from the Youth Committee has a very important announcement and request. Oh. Download.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Youth Mentor Recruitment.
Alhamdulillah, it's really good to see so much knowledge being absorbed and being given. I've only been Muslim for 4 years, so this is a wonderful opportunity that you all have been afforded. And the reason why I'm here, I'll be very quick and to the point because I know we're going to go over time, is I want to give you guys an opportunity, inshallah, to put into practice the knowledge that you're learning. I'm from, like Imam Mustafa Omar just said, the youth committee. I'm one of the youth coordinators. I was just brought on this year, and it's me, Brother Omar Salama, and Sister Samina Muhammad. We're the youth coordinators, and we're responsible for the youth at this masjid. We need mentors for our Friday night youth program.